Hello, friends of Herbie, and welcome back to this first episode of 2021 of the Campfire Talks with Herbie. I know there are many new people on this broadcast, so maybe I should just spend 2 words on why it is called the Campfire Talks with Herbie. Herbie was a figure in the business novel The Goal of Eliyahu Goldratt, and he was a Boy Scout walking through the woods with his team. And I won't tell you all the story, but he was the protagonist of that walk. And we always inspire our thoughts by that story. So that's why we have these campfire talks with Herbie. We imagine that we are all sitting around the campfire and talking about interesting topics. In a moment, I will introduce you to the topic of this evening and my guests. But before, just a bit of housekeeping. As you probably know, I wrote a book with Daniel Dwaron, and he is having another webinar in 2 days with John Coleman on the topic of flawed mental models. You can see the URL there, and if you miss it now, you might come back to the recording and pick it up afterwards. Anyway, what are we talking about this evening? We are talking about patterns of success. We have all an idea of what a pattern is. It's like the common acceptation of a cookie cutter of something that you can use as a model. But in the conversation we're having this evening, we are inspired by the works of Christopher Alexander, who was an architect and developed a way of thinking in terms of what eventually became known as the Alexandrian Patterns. And TameFlow, the method that I have developed, is entirely based on patterns. So that is the relevance to these campfire talks with Herbie. So let me now, as we say, with no further ado, introduce you to our 2 guests. First, we have Al Shalloway. Hello, Al, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. And then we have Jeff Anderson. Hello, Jeff. Welcome to the show as well.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me as well.
So I'm really glad that you decided to join, because I know that both of you, Al, I think you're playing around with the microphone. It's
Sorry, I was moving the computer, but I'll leave it alone.
So I know that both of you are very much into patterns. So that was the reason why I wanted to have you on this show. And to the audience, no, this is not a panel. This is more a free form format. Think about it as talks that we might have at the bar. Unfortunately, we don't have drinks here, but we can certainly arrange for that afterwards. So let's start with Al. Al, I know you are famous in this space, but not everyone knows who you are. So maybe tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, I will. Well, I'm now with the PMI. I'm a director of thought leadership for Agile at Scale programs. I was acquired, or my company was acquired a year and a half ago. I had been the CEO with Net Objectives, and from 99 to 2019. And prior to that, I'd gotten about, 30 years experience as a developer. What's relevant to today is when I started becoming a coach consultant in the late 90s, I started studying design patterns, because up until around 2000, like 30 years, heavy developer. One of these 10x programmers who wrote a lot of crappy code. So I'm not saying 10x like that's a great thing, because my code was crappy, but I could write it fast. It would work. It was just fragile. And I learned what patterns were, but I thought of patterns a bit different. I wrote a book called Design Patterns Explained: Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software with Jim Trott. And it's still one of its kind as far as I can tell, because it's not like the Head First Patterns book, which is awesome, that tells you what the patterns as solutions are. It's actually about the thought process behind the patterns. So the work I've been doing in process and Agile at Scale and Scrum and Kanban, I mean, I've been around the block with all of these, having been an early user of Scrum and XP, and then Kanban. I was with David Anderson, not with him now, but with Lean Kanban University, early practitioner with SAFe and a contributor. But one of the shifts for me then was from technical to the process, both at the team and at the whole scale. And actually, if you're interested, we have this thing we call Discipline Agile Flex, which was something I took from Net Objectives, and we're going to be releasing it in March. It's PMI's new large scale. But I did want to start out with something about patterns and that's relevant to what I do. So as most of you are familiar with patterns on the technical side, they've been referred to as solutions to recurring problems in a context. And that comes from Chris Alexander's book, Timeless Way of Building, which, although it's, I don't know, what, 50 years old or something, highly, highly recommend. It is the best design approach, bar none, in my mind. It's something I do now. It's how I learned to design and write good code, was part of it. That and acceptance test-driven development and TDD, of course, was part of that. But in that book, he just starts out saying patterns are solutions to recurring problems in a context. But at the end of the book, page 545, you can check me, of a 549-page book, so kind of at the very end. He says, at this point, you discover that patterns aren't important. That's kind of like I joke in my design patterns class. I say, well, why didn't you tell me this on page 2? And I had to shut the book. He says that patterns have taught you to be receptive to what's real. And what's real are these issues that are present. But earlier in the book, he said he said one other thing, and then I'm adding something, but I'm sure he would agree. So the other thing he talks about is one of the values of patterns is you can use them to inject structure into a system. In fact, that's how you should use them. He uses the word complexification, which is kind of funny, but since probably a lot of the people here are interested in process, I'll give you an example. In most organizations, you have this idea of the business side here, portfolio management, what we're doing, and you have that implementation. Now, I'm not saying it should be this way, but it often is this way. And we talk about how to manage that, how to go on to other more advanced things like in humanocracy, they talk about it. But there's a pattern here. Portfolio management, implementation, or I'll say product management, business discovery, and implementation, delivery, and support.
Hello.
And in fact, that is a pattern that injects this structure. But the second thing it does is what's the relationship between this group of people and the relationship between this group of people. Now, I don't remember, and Steve, you inject this because you probably do know. I don't remember him saying this, but the best way I think to think about systems is they're not the components. As Russ Aikoff said, and you should Google this, what if Russ Aikoff gave a TED Talk? He talks about systems are defined by the relationships between the components. So the patterns are actually doing three things. One, they give us a way to set the structure, like business development. They give us a way to specify the relationship between things. And then guess what? They give us solutions to a recurrent context called I got business and I've got development. And that's actually what Flex is based on. And I just wanted to put this in as a context. Not saying I'm right, because if Steve or Jeff want to disagree, I'm all for that too. But that's how I'm thinking. And I wanted to create the context of how I'm thinking about patterns.
You pinpointed many things, and I took notes, and I'll get back to them.
I'm good.
And now I want to hear now Jeff. Jeff, you have been around for quite a while as well, and I know you've done some really innovative work. So tell us a bit more. I know your background and what you have been doing as of lately.
So I'll give the Agile portions of my background. Probably around the year 2002, 2003. I went from being, I'll call it an Agile-enabled software engineer, and I fell accidentally into management consulting. I was working for Deloitte at the time, and me and my team were always doing it differently. Waterfall was still big back then. Heavy iterative type development was big back then. And I think we were the only team that our partnership knew of that was abandoning all that, following extreme programming, test-driven development, all that kind of good stuff. And the market was starting to shift so that big tier consultancies weren't being asked to do a lot of these software intensive programs. So one of the partners at the firm at the time, his name was Michael Tang, he suggested that I shift from pure implementation and get into more of an advisory role and start trying to teach other people how to do this. And so this was, 2004, 2005. Agile was not mainstream at all at the time. So we got pretty good at sort of riding this countercultural wave inside the firm and finding clients who wanted to do things a little bit differently. After about 10 years or so, a core group of us split off to run our own company, Agile by Design. And the fun thing about that is that we've got big enterprise experience, but that's not causing us to shy away from anything that's new and novel. We're always trying to push the envelope on what's the next leading edge thing that we can try, because the space continues to innovate at a dramatic pace. And it's important, some of the agile, I'll call it some of the agile parts of the community, or some of have become a little bit too conservative in my mind, and they've become a little bit too sort of staid in how they're approaching things.
And you have also written a book, right?
That's right. So, and how this could talk about how we or how I relate to patterns. So the book is definitely a working title. I actually think it's become a lot more than the original scope. What I wanted to do, and what I'm trying to do with this book, is actually look at organizations and organizational design in a different light. Most of the established theory, textbooks, all the stuff that the human capital type people look at when it comes to organizational design is still based on the old antiquated model of departments, functions, control structures, hierarchy, basically. And it doesn't talk a lot about how things actually get done, which is never that way. People don't create value through hierarchies and control. They create value because they understand who they need to collaborate with to get value out to the market. So I wanted to approach organizational design from how do we enable, call it the value network, call it the sort of the edge organization. How do you enable the people that are delivering value to get as close as possible as they can to their markets with the least amount of interference, but at the same time still be in an organization that is supported by a common ecosystem that doesn't have to reinvent everything from the wheel. And there's been a lot of patterns that I've seen just through real implementation of trying to get teams working in large enterprises and teams. And there's been a huge amount of patterns that might have been implicit when I started looking at things like lean, Kanban, systems thinking that I don't think are actually in the agile taxonomy. So what I wanted to do with this book is make some of those patterns as explicit as I possibly could, so that when you're trying to move your organization towards greater agility, you're not reinventing everything from scratch or trying to figure it out all on your own.
Okay, and as we are showing here on the banner below, your book is on leanpub.com/agile organization design, even if the title is organizational design. So people can go there and find this book. I think it's one of the most innovative approaches that are out there. Well, innovative maybe in the context of the current state of the agile world, but let me tell a bit about my background here. The elements of patterns have been with me from the very beginning. So my story starts way back in the late 80s and early 90s. And at that point, I was a software engineer with Borland International. I was actually their technical director in Italy, of all places. What does this have to do with patterns? Well, you might have heard, if you've read The Origins of Scrum, that Jeff Sutherland was mightily influenced by a study done by Jim Coplin while he was in AT&T. And there he was trying to figure out, now, what is it that makes a great software development organization? AT&T was developing software by the metric tons, so that was certainly something in their interest. And in this study, Coplin looked at many different companies and found one which was an outlier in any way that it was being measured. And it was Borland International, the makers of Turbo Pascal, Turbo C, and all those legendary products, even Delphi and so on. And eventually, he started documenting these findings. Actually, the process he used to describe the companies was not that of a process engineer like you would expect from someone at AT&T, but was rather based on approaches of sociology and anthropology. And he started documenting these findings in a form, in a documentational form that eventually became patterns. And he eventually wrote this book, Organizational Patterns of Agile Software, which Agile Software Development, which summarizes that way of thinking. And when this was announced in the Borland conference of, I think it was 1992, I didn't know about patterns at all, but I discovered them and I connected the dots. So I started looking at what happened at Borland at that time through the lens of organizational patterns. And eventually that became the basis of all my thinking around how you can organize companies, teams, people to work in this context. Now, as I went forward, I discovered even other things. Like I discovered Kanban, I discovered TOC, and I put all those things together, but always with the pattern lens. But I always had the intention of writing more about patterns. And besides the book I recently published with Daniel Dwaron, Tame Your Workflow, and for which Al wrote an incredible testimonial. So I have to thank you, Al, for that one. It was really an amazing testimonial. Well, besides writing this book, I always have the ambition and intention to write a patterns book. And I actually started in 2016 with the Tame Flow Patterns book. It's still a draft. It's been in a draft state since 2016. I hope that I will find time sometime to write it, but you can find it even there on LeanPub, and with that code that you see running there, it's available for free for the next 24 hours. So leanpub.com, tameflow-patterns/patterns of success 2021. If you've never looked into patterns in the theoretical underpinnings of patterns and pattern theory, well, there you will find a summary. And some of those ideas, of those underpinnings, Al already mentioned in his comments. And let me pick up some of the things that you said, Al. The point of the relationships with reference to Akov's TED Talk, which is a really great TED Talk, and I did an extensive comment about it on last week's newsletter, and there the weight of the thinking was on the relationships between components and patterns. When you start expressing patterns in terms of a pattern language, you are actually documenting those relationships. That's why I find that patterns are so powerful, because they do not only talk about the structure, about the things that are out there, but how these relate to one another. And the pattern language allows you to compose these thoughts in an intellectual way. So the pattern language becomes both an element of descriptive element by which you can describe a reality, And I use this often when I go out at client sites and I look around what is there, and I relate that to known patterns. So it's a way of documenting, of doing a diagnosis in medical terms. But then its more powerful implication is that it's a design language, so it can be used to design new solutions, which are not only the structures but also the new relationships between these structures. There is one very important element, I think, that makes the Alexandrian architectural patterns and the software design patterns different from organizational patterns. And that is that the prevalence of structure is clear when you speak about architecture, because you see it. It's a block of concrete. It has a shape, but you touch it. While when we are in knowledge work, things are more intangible. You cannot really touch them. And therefore, what I find more interesting is if you look at the pattern form, how you document a pattern, there is the section about the forces. So documenting the forces, which can be even psychological forces, can be social forces, can be anything that pertains to the daily friction we have as human beings when we interact with others, or even moments of happiness and joy. Well, those are the forces that we can capture with patterns and start reasoning about. So we don't leave them there in the like gray area, unknown space. We know they are there, but we can't really talk about them. So in that sense, I think that the patterns are an exceptionally good tool to start reasoning about knowledge work and the dynamics of knowledge work, social people that interact and communicate, coordinate, make decisions, and so on and so forth. So who wants to comment on that?
I'd love to just describe or just discuss further why patterns are so appealing in the organizing of people and the process context, especially when you talked about a design language that provides choice. One thing that I've seen happen with a lot of the thinking in the agile world, and it's kind of dismaying, is, hey, the more that we're going to scale agile, the more process we're going to apply, the more we're going to apply a fixed framework to solve the problem. By the way, it's nice to see that DA Flex does not do that, by the way. It comes in with an approach and says, here's some ways of doing things. But if you look at whether it's Scrum that's super, super simple, or SAFe, which is super, super complicated, it doesn't really talk about choice. It talks about here's the things you have to do, and then it leaves more or less white space for you to figure out everything else. And I don't think that's useful if you're the CEO of a mid-sized organization or an EVP of a line of business, and you've got 1,000 people in your organization, and you're trying to say, how do I increase agility? On one hand, you've got all of this sort of method and framework and very, very fixed sort of things that you can do. And the other hand, you have white space. And what I particularly like about patterns and a pattern language is that you can say, okay, if I'm trying to, change the way that I want to be organized to deliver value, if I want to increase agility, I could follow the agile sort of big A agile team pattern, which is a cross-functional team as close to the market as I can get to it. The team's got everything and anything that it needs, and it gets to make all the decisions. And that tends to be the one single pattern that people who are agile purists will tend to follow. But by just taking that sort of big A agile team and saying, I'm going to contrast that with a service provider. And a service provider takes a request from a consumer or a client or somebody, might collaborate with that consumer to figure out exactly what that person wants, might even get feedback frequently, but fundamentally takes on the role of doing it. That is, the opposite sort of, of that value network of that agile, big A agile team, because you're incurring a handoff. But there may be some situations where a handoff, if it's done really, really well, makes more economic sense for the organization. And there are obviously situations where we want to kind of eliminate those handoffs. So by having a pattern language, what you can start doing is designing your organization or designing your process in a way that's fit for purpose, but it still follows some fundamental principles. So very long answer, but I hope it got somewhere.
Al, your turn.
Yeah, I definitely want to build on what you're saying, because there is an underlying dilemma that the Agile community, in my opinion, has all gone to one side, and it's not the right way to go. And what this dilemma is, two things that very much appear to be in conflict with each other. And one of them is that people like answers. They like to be told what to do. I learned this a long time ago when I actually literally had the lead of the manager who brought some people in that I was trying to teach team agility. And at lunch of the first day of a 2-day course, he said, if you keep up giving us all this abstract principles and crap, we're not coming back tomorrow. I mean, literally, he told me this about 12 years ago. And I was trying to blend Kanban and Scrum. And I realized, okay, these guys want an answer. But you know what? There is no one answer. So now you got this problem. They want to know what to do. And in this case, they were demanding it. On the other hand, there is no one answer. So what do you do? And this is where patterns can actually connect things together. And by the way, they did come back, and it was a great course. What I ended up doing was instead of giving them like the whole background of what they could do, I knew what their problems were. I'd worked with this company before, and out of the conversations. So I basically told them what to do that worked for them. Like it was kind of mostly Scrum, a little bit of Kanban mixed in, but it was good. So this question, we want to know what to do. There is no one what to do. Now, the problem is this. How do you get something that you do need if you're not an expert? So, well, there are two solutions. One, of course, and this is kind of what DA Flex is. I'm not trying to sell it. I'm just trying to use it as an example. It's an approach that a consultant can take and make what I call a prescribed start. In other words, you look at the company, you figure out what they need, and then you give them something to do. It's not a framework, but it's like a playbook, or you could call it a pre-planning workbook that says, well, this is what fits you, and you go with that. And then you could also use that to continue and improve it. But here's the thing. These consultants who can do that, and I'm sure a lot of you out in the audience can do this, you're pretty experienced. You have made the transition from some core principles to how do you translate that to specific actions. Okay. And this is where patterns could come in, because I would say in some sense, I don't know if I've ever said this before publicly, but I'm going to say it now anyway. I'll wait for Steve to tear me up on it, because he usually, if I'm wrong, he'll let me know. But in a very high level view, I would say we have three things we're dealing with the value stream. One is what goes into the value stream. Is it the right size? Is it focused on what the customer needs? It's like what goes in. Then, like what Jeff's talking about, is what's the structure? In other words, now that work is going to have to move through all the people, and how they're organized is going to have a big impact on that. And then, of course, there's what's the workflow? Like, are you doing tests first? How are you doing handoffs? How are people collaborating? So at an extremely abstract, simple level, we got three things. What goes in? What's the structure? What's the workflow through? Now, that's pretty abstract. That's way, 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 way too abstract for a lot of people. And if you think about it, there are all these different things that could go in. There are all these different structures you can have. I mean, Jeff wrote a whole book on that, So, and then there are all sorts of workflows, Scrum, Kanban, Safe, whatever. So how do you go from this high level, super abstract down to specifics? See, this is where patterns are useful.
Yeah, I think that's a absolutely fundamental question, and I'll comment on that. But let's, Al, you mentioned the audience, so let's just quickly say hello to the folks here. We have
I see a lot of familiar names. Hi.
Mark, he's known as question mark because he always asks questions, and I'm surprised he hasn't yet, but I'm sure he will take care of that. Of course, we have Daniel Dwaron. We have Rudiger from UK. Hello, Rudiger. We have Anna from Montreal, Canada. We got Sri from New York, one of the first TameFlow trainers in the US. We have Niklas Kari from Helsinki. Welcome, Niklas. We have Benny from Zermatt in Switzerland. Lucky you, that's a lovely, beautiful place. We have Jersey from Poland, and he mentions greetings from the Friends of Herbie from Warsaw. Lovely. Well, we have Christiana from Cyprus. Thank you, Christiana, for joining. We have Jim Price from Phoenix, Arizona. Minton from New York. Enrique from Ecuador. So quite a broad international participation. And now one more just came in here. Richard Lissimore from London. Welcome to Richard as well. So Al, now what you were describing, you came to this like final abstract, high level vision of things that go in the structure and the workflow. That's clearly the case. The major problem with the pattern approach, at least in my experience, is what you hinted at in the middle of your intervention there, that people sort of expect to find pre-made solutions, the cookie cutter. And when you say pattern, they get the idea of the cookie cutter. So the common acceptation that you get something, you just put pressure on it and it creates what you want. But the Alexandrian pattern is far from a cookie cutter because it needs the context to begin with. And every context is different. Even the context of one company changes by the day. So there are no absolutes in that sense. And one of the big challenges I've always had was that of being able to help companies who are facing problems, but as you said, they want these cookie cutter solutions. So it's a conundrum. You have something that really works, but the substrate is like not receptive because there is an expectation of something else. So this needs some subterfuge, some Trojan horse, if you wish. And in the book, the last chapter, I introduced this notion of proto-patterns. I deliberately do not call them patterns, but proto-patterns, because they are like almost a pattern, and they are simple. You can read one; it's often just one page or two, and you could go out and try it. But actually, that is just a guess. I'm guessing that having seen these things many times, there will be some element of context that is applicable. So giving a broad menu, 20 odd patterns, not too many because then people get overwhelmed, but 20 odd patterns and giving some sort of sequencing, you are trying to give a structured approach, but still it's not pattern thinking. And I think they do need some more hand-holding. And I think what you're coming up with, the playbooks, maybe you can tell us a bit more about that. The idea of the playbooks is really like preparing the ground for these more open-ended approaches, which are entirely adaptable and flexible. So this is the connection to agility. Why are patterns so agile? Because they are so very much context specific, unlike frameworks which preset the context. And this is also a reason why the frameworks are so successful, because they give you a pre-digested context, which, if you're lucky, works. If you're not lucky, well, you're being told that you're not doing it right. So no, that's another story. Jeff, your comments.
I actually think the biggest challenge with patterns is what you just said, which is people want the solution. And it's been my experience that you can't operate an agile organization if you can't design it. There's no shortcut to being able to successfully increase your agility. There's no shortcut to the learning, really. So what I've been very lucky, or and been somewhat successful at doing, is whenever I go and I do any type of, call it an agile change or a lean change or Kanban or whatever, has been to start with saying, we're going to co-create this with you guys. And it's gonna have to be fit for purpose for your needs, because if it's not, it's going to fail. And that often means we end up with a much simpler, less sophisticated solution than we might like. And there's a lot of less practices and methods and techniques and all the other things. but whatever is adopted is something that the client understands. An example will be I've got a client and they're trying to get a huge portfolio worth of work done, and they're really having trouble having completely atomic independent teams. It's just not working because there's some legacy systems, there's some ad hoc work. So we start laying out some of these patterns in a very simplistic way. Like, okay, you've got the big A Agile team. That's one pattern. You've got a set of enablers that are there to help guide and advise others. That's another pattern. You might have some traveling team workers. That's another pattern. And trying to explain these in an abstract way, but then very quickly saying, okay, how does this apply to your system of work? How can we make this practical right away? And they don't really care if I'm using the word patterns or if they're engaging in pattern thinking or not. What's important is you're giving them building blocks that they can assemble and reassemble quite quickly and easily. And as they get better at it, then you can get deeper into, what does it mean? What does this pattern language mean? And what are some of the options and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, I want to build off both what Steve and Jeff said here, because I think patterns do something that is very important in bridging this dilemma. So a pattern has an intention, has an objective, has something you're trying to accomplish. And although there is a solution, the solution isn't really hard-coded in that sense. Like in software, we should know this. There are a lot of different ways to implement any of the software design patterns. But same thing in process. For example, I'll continue building off this. How does the business talk to technology? Well, at some point, say if you're doing SAFe, one way business talks to technology is you have this planning event, which you say, we're going to take 3 months worth of work and put it on a backlog. So we have this product backlog that's really, really big. And there's this agreement on what that has to look like. And then you have a couple of days or whatever, and you pull it into basically the program increment. This is what we're going to do. Well, that is a way to do it. I got about 3 or 4 or 5 other ways to do it based on what people need. But the intention, the abstract concept, the what's needed is the same. How do I get the work in? And I could be using iterations. I could be using flow. I could be using big group planning. I could do it, whatever. But here's the interesting thing about the pattern. The concept of the pattern is the same for all of us. And then I have different patterns that implement that concept. So it provides a way to go from an abstract notion of getting work from the business to the teams, and then different ways of implementing it. Now, I could even take a step further. We talk about pattern languages and such. Well, in Flex, just again as an example, we talk about the most common one. The most common pattern language is when you have business and when you have a development. But actually, we know that's not a good structure. We really should have more self-contained entrepreneurial organization, like in Humanocracy, he talks about micro enterprises. That's actually a better way of doing it. You have these small groups that are business and development. Oh, well, guess what? This pattern of splitting the two, you don't want to apply in that situation. You'd have a different pattern called, I have small groups that are business driven and include the technology. So when we talk about patterns and pattern languages, what's cool about them is what we're really trying to do is, of course, get more value done by the customer. The customer can actually consume and get more value. But based on the maturity of the organization, the component of the organization, the culture of the organization, we actually might have several different pattern languages to implement. But a lot of these things, they're not plug and play per se, but they're all defined. Every pattern should be defined by an objective, specifying what are the components involved in that, and then a variety of ways of implementing it. So final point, and then I know you got something to say, Steve, but let me finish this one here. This gives a way. Remember, we had the dilemma of I need to know what to do, and it's too abstract trying to go after principles. Patterns give us a way to bridge this, because I can talk about, well, you're going to do this, but here's what you're trying to do. In fact, I created something I called Scrum as example years ago. Say, hey, you want to start with Scrum? Great, start with Scrum. But think of it as an example. I have a cross-functional team as a way of team structure. I have iterations as a way of managing my time boxing or my flowing. And anything there I can change as long as I implement the objective of that practice or role or event. And then you break free from the structure. Some people call it framework prison. You can go outside of the framework, do whatever you need to without doing like bad Scrum, but because you're still doing all the intentions you should be doing. And that's a lot of what frameworks miss. They don't talk about the objectives. The objectives become do this, do this, do this, instead of solve this problem. I'm sorry, say that again.
The objective is to follow the framework.
Exactly. And if you don't, you got Scrum Butt. Anyway, I'm done, Steve. I know you're going to comment.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I know Jeff. Oh, by the way, we have Tom Gilb joining us.
Oh, hi, Tom.
Yeah. We got Tom there. Hi, Tom from Norway. We have some other people who's here. Jorge Ronquese from Buenos Aires. And okay, well, I want to know who this is. Chimpanzee. Well, nice book. Thank you. Funny names. And Jeff, I noticed that you put up a new link there. I assume that is a free coupon. Is that right?
That's right.
So no, thank you very much for this this gift for the audience here. So you can get a copy of Jeff's book for free as well. And then who do we have here? Slow BI. Okay, I think that is Kenneth. Hello, Kenneth. This thing with intention is really deep. You know why? Because it is the thing that allows the connection with Goldratt. The goal is the ultimate intention of the organization, and therefore, if you can start organizing patterns in a pattern language where the forces within these patterns like converge, align, are in synergy, and they all work towards the goal, you're basically supporting the way of thinking of the theory of constraints with a pattern construct. And that's what I'm doing when we come to strategy development and strategy implementation. In TameFlow, I use a construct which at the end of the day is a pattern language, but where you would see like elements of OKRs in the sense that you have a hierarchy maybe of things that need to be done, or even more, you see connections to the strategy and tactics trees of Goldratt. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's like the evolution of the thinking processes for various industrial sectors. But all those approaches, including Goldratt's, are very much hierarchical. And going back to Akov and the interrelationships between elements, the fact is that if you can find a network of patterns that together bring their forces towards the achievement of that goal, and you can measure that in a consistent manner, for instance, with flow metrics, throughput, and so on, then you have some very powerful, explosively powerful thinking tools, and that's what I've been trying to do with the bringing pattern thinking in towards the ideas of constraints management. And mind you, constraints are another, from a pattern perspective, they are just a force inside a pattern. So there is a lot of things that we can connect between TOC and pattern theory. Jeff?
Well, I actually think also the inverse is true. Almost every one of my patterns that I put together in my book, I've tried to show how to make the pattern live through flow and Kanban. Because Kanban is such a good way of visualizing structure that's both static and dynamic. You can sort of, represent teams as different swim lanes. You could represent different ways that people pair or mob or swarm around problems dynamically through allocating people to work on the board. You could have different parts of your organization be static and different parts be flexible, coming from pools and traveling around. So I actually think using Kanban and flow to visualize these patterns, as well as measure the effectiveness of the patterns, is extremely powerful. I think a lot of people misinterpret things like Kanban and flow as a visual board with sticky notes. flowing across. I mean, yeah, yes, it is that. You have the visualness, but it's the ability to actually empower people to dynamically organize around the work. I think is one of its most important facets, actually. And helping people to understand that through identifying some of these patterns, I think is actually really powerful. So I just wanted to add that you were talking about how TLC really it does have a set of patterns, but it's also this amazing way, you know, especially with Kanban, to kind of visualize some of this stuff and get people to start recognizing how some of this can work.
You know, as you two are talking, taking this another level out, and that's consistent with both of your work and my work and everything we've been talking about, is sometimes people look, one of the challenges I find with when you kind of have an approach, like a solution-based approach, like Scrum and SAFe are two of the examples, but most systems do this, is there's this thing called the definition of Scrum. There's this thing called the definition of SAFe. And when you look at it, there's something missing. It's so missing. It's like water to the fish and air to the birds. And what's missing is the organization it's going into. In other words, if you're doing systems thinking, Scrum and SAFe by themselves are not a system. They're a framework that fits into the system called an organization doing Scrum or an organization doing SAFe. And if you're doing systems thinking, your system is not SAFe. Your system is not Scrum. It's the organization attempting to do it. And what triggered this was, thanks, Chimpanzee, this cleaning up the McKinsey Spotify mess. Yeah, and I totally agree. I totally agree with this.
So
I even wrote.
Read that, Al. No, this is.
Oh, he says, I'm always coming into an org to clear up the McKinsey Spotify mess first. So at least there's a common baseline for initial starting conditions / patterns. But
so
the thing is,
we have a context that is common for everyone there, right?
well, it's interesting. You know, it's interesting. I had nothing to do with Spotify, but I knew the players there. And when it was written up, I said, "Oh, we've done this for a couple of years. We called different things. There are reasons we didn't like using tribes and squads, but the two models are identical. But it was a process for when you had a few teams and you were a growing organization. Okay, Spotify is not something to apply. It's something if you're small and growing, there are some interesting concepts you can use. But this notion that you could take something that worked someplace and then apply it to where you are ignores that where they were and where you are probably two different things. And this is an important aspect of systems thinking. It's what are the relationships, what are the components, but it's an important aspect of patterns because it's within a context. So what's the context? So squads and tribes and all that as the Spotify model will apply differently depending upon what you're trying to do. I've seen some really big companies go ahead and put Spotify in, and man, that's, like you say, that's almost the first thing I got to get rid of. There's some good ideas, but this is not how to structure your organization. So we need to look at that aspect of systems. And this is why you sometimes need different pattern languages, different views, because depending upon what the company is trying to do, what the culture is trying to do, you really need to you need to take the patterns that fit that context. And I'm not saying you don't reorganize companies. I'm not, like Jeff's books about a lot of different things you could reorganize. And you have to, of course, pay attention to Conway's law, which is ignored in most places. I do like team topologies work a lot as well in this area. But you have to attend to those things. And the system is all of this. And predefined approaches will get you started. But I've been asking this question, and it's funny, not many people have been talking about it. What's the fit for purpose? We talk about simple. See, I would suggest Scrum, when you look at it as it is, yeah, it's real simple. By the way, so is the unicycle. Unicycle is much simpler than a bike. I ride both, or I used to ride a unicycle. I might be getting a little old for it now. I used to be the #1 unipolo player in the world, I'll have you know. That's when you play polo on unicycles. Kind of dangerous, actually. But in my 20s and 30s, I was more of a crazy guy than I am now, I suppose. But the point is that by itself, it might be simple. But when you embed it in the wrong structure, the whole system is now kind of complicated because it's not fit for purpose. This is what frameworks tend to do. They show you how they work, but how do they work within an organization? I'm sorry, one last thing. I know I kind of went on, and if you want to go around and come back to me. In fact, why don't we do that? Go around, come back to me. I'm going to bring up the value stream.
Yeah, I want to pick up some more comments from Jim Price. The issue isn't so much learners wanting to be told what to do. Learners want knowledge expressed in a lingua franca. Otherwise, learners must sift through the rubble, a non-starter. And then he continues, perhaps better described as sifting through the noise. I think we just lost Jeff as well. Probably come back. Well, yes, that's clearly a key point that Jim brings up there. That the common language element. Now, this will set me off a tangent here, but it's sort of related because there are patterns behind this. The thing that this stimulates my thinking about is the positioning that much of Agile has towards management. Agile has by tradition, especially the Scrum faction, has held positions that are clearly anti-management. Originally, you might remember there was the chicken and pigs metaphor, which then became not politically correct and was dropped. But that sort of culture of contraposition between the practitioners and management is very, very widespread in this industry. So what does this have to do with a lingua franca? Well, the fact is that practitioners on the ground do not have a common language to communicate with those who are in management positions, even mid-managers, say the PMOs. And therefore, it's very difficult to have constructive conversations. There is always this tension. Managers will think, oh, those guys, they never deliver. And those guys will think, oh, managers really don't understand. They don't they are not in contact with reality, and so on and so forth. So one of the points that I've been trying to develop with TameFlow that is very much focused on the metrics aspect, and Jeff was mentioning that before, is to create a series of mental models, which are a transposition of patterns into something more comprehensible, that allow both managers, mid-managers, and people on the ground to actually reason in a common language. And if they reason in a common language, they can start to communicate. They can start to see problems from the same perspective. They are on the same side of the problem rather than on opposing side of the problems. And then they see through the problem and just fight one another. So the pattern thinking there, I think, is very powerful, because you structure things in terms of opposing forces, and then you bring them together in terms of a common language that they can all talk and converse with. We got Jeff that came back, so welcome back, Jeff. We have another comment. I leave this one for you in a moment, Al, but you will prepare. Now, when is the PMI going to release some flex stuff? Would love to buy a book or something. Just hang on a moment. You will reply to that. And we have Niklas. The top strategy consultancies are good at selling their services to the boards and C-levels of the top Fortune companies, including their Agile practices. Pure play Agilists should be better at this. Well, I totally agree, and I think both Flex and TameFlow are relating to what I just said, are setting up a vocabulary, a way of expressing and talking that can address the concerns of the C-levels. So we would get more attention. So going back there to chimpanzee, do you want to reply to this one, Al?
Yeah, I wish I had a book to sell you. I'm still working on it too. We are doing our beta, which should be then the last workshop before we release it. We've already done an alpha in March, so there is going to be an offering then. And right after that, we should be making it public. There is a way to get a lot of information that's on a website that's actually the old Net Objective site still, but it's going to get moved to the PMI soon. And I'm going to put the URL in the private chat. To be candid, I'm not sure how I could do the comment, but if one of you two has figured it out, I've never used this stream before.
I'm getting that.
Yeah, just put that out there. So what I'm doing is I'm putting out some information that's kind of like a self-study, and we use the Disciplined Agile LinkedIn user group to help with things. And one of the things, Flex, by the way, stands for Flow and Lean Transformation, Enterprise Transformation. And one of the things it's based on is the value stream. And value stream's been misconstrued in many ways, particularly with its subtle redefinition by SAFe of being based somewhat on the people involved in the value stream. Value stream does have people in it, but it's actually defined by the workflow. But that's all I'm going to talk about that now. But this is the other point I wanted to make. And Jeff, sorry you lost your turn, but I'm sure Steve will come back and balance it. One of the things, so we've been talking about patterns and context, and I've talked about how patterns create a structure. Well, if you think about the value stream, I'm going to suggest, and you've seen this in your own experience, I'm certain, that things upstream, like things product management does, has an impact downstream. In fact, many organizations are working with development because that's where the fire is. That's where all the burning is. But in fact, it's stuff happening way early, like poorly defined requirements, too big requirements, working on too many things, having the wrong structure. It's like you've got this gasoline leak at the top of the hill, and it's all going downhill, and it's all burning downhill. And you think, oh, I got a problem downhill. Look at all that fire. And you got to look upstream. What's causing that fire? The point is that in the value stream, where I do portfolio, product, handoff, development, integration, DevOps, or whatever it is, goes out to the customer. Each of those further down steps is creating the context for the further down steps is being created by an upstream effect. And there's another aspect to this that's worth mentioning, and I'll just cut Steve off on this because I'm sure he'd mention it if I didn't. This is part of what the theory of constraints is about. If you've got something that's not causing you any problems, then you don't need to worry about it. But if you've got a bottleneck, if you've got something that's limiting, then what you do is you look at all the other aspects in the context of this, and how can I remove this bottleneck? How can I remove this constraint? So you identify things so you can see how the different pieces of the organization, how the workflow through it is creating context for the others, as well as the inherent natural flow of value is creating context for the others. So patterns also talk about that. And that's part of the structure that gets injected when you work on the pattern. So it creates a thought process. Anyway, Steve?
Yeah, well, I'd like to hear Jeff, because he dropped the connection and his round. So,
Canadian internet.
Sorry?
I said thank you, Canadian internet.
Canadian internet. Yeah, I guess it's because it's so cold there that the internet goes down. Is it, or
the bytes freeze?
The bytes freeze.
It should be faster. It's in that when you get done super cooling, it all works better.
That's right.
Do you have any comments on these last points, Jeff? We also had some. Well, maybe let's see from the audience. There's one more comment from Richard. Would you expect to see some pattern standardization across approaches and with Cope's work, both in the original patterns book and his most recent Scrum book? A very interesting question. I will just add my comments briefly. I would say no, because patterns are so flexible that they can represent even different interpretations of reality. So if I and Al, and I think this is a case in point, we look at the same thing, because of our experience and background, we see different things and we would use different patterns. But because we are creating languages, we can also create mappings and work together. So in that sense, they are tools of collaboration, but I don't see a standardization thing. Jeff, what's your take on this?
Well, I mean, if I look at two books that are the most similar to what I'm writing, I would say Team Topologies and Dynamic Reteaming are two books that touch on the idea of how to scale a human way of working, basically, without devolving into the old machinery way of doing things. And they have slightly different ways of describing some of the same concepts that I have. And in some cases, it's 90% the same with a 10% delta. So I could have tried to rename all my patterns and recategorize them and sort of restructure it around them, but I don't think that's necessary. I think what's better to do is, to your point, is I'm starting to put in some of that mapping to say, oh, by the way, I'm calling this an enabler, and here's my definition. But in team topologies, enablement is considered something a little bit different. And here's the pros and cons of thinking about it, in this slightly different way. So that's my attempt to try to get to some standardization. At the end of the day, I think what you said, Stephen, was right on the money, is these things are relatively easy to map. And so when you're going to a client, don't give them all the pattern languages and all the mappings and everything else. That will just confuse them. Pick the 7, I think you said 12 patterns, Alan, but pick the 7 to 12 patterns that you think will provide some options and create sort of a consolidated or concise vocabulary for your clients to use so that they have a sandbox to play in, basically. But the one standard to rule them all, I don't really see the value.
I agree with what you said. I don't know where you got 7 to 12. In our playbook, it's about 35.
Oh, I thought you said 12 patterns, or maybe it was right in the beginning of the discussion.
Yeah, it might have been something else. But in like DA Flex, we work with about 35. And then that doesn't even include all the lower level patterns you could do at a team. Right. So they're probably about 50 or 60. That's somewhere we talk about. And that sounds like a lot to navigate, actually. I was looking at this actually the other day because tomorrow morning in my alpha group I've got where I'm actually going to be presenting this new playbook thing. And at first I was thinking, wow, this is a lot. 35 people are going to think that's a lot. And then I thought about it 2 ways. One is you look at the safe big picture, and there are 100 things out there. So one of the first things I do is I say, what of these are relevant? And you can get a default and have it be fixed, but you want to skim it down. But the real piece to me is this. See, of those 35, there is if you're in this structure of I got a business and I got a development, the order with which you do it is somewhat fixed, not the whole thing, but some of the order is fixed. Because like if you don't have an intake process, say, then that's going to cause all sorts of other problems. So it's kind of like, don't fix the other problems if they're being caused by this. You got to work on this first. So there is a natural ordering in this. And this is something...
We have this comment which is just spot on from Jim Price. Flow effectiveness and efficiency, TOC and Kanban, are predicated on the quality of requirements, business, user, functional, non-functional.
Yeah, so you could have a great process to get stuff built, and if you're putting the wrong thing in, it's crap. So that's one of the things I'm talking about. So some of these are kind of inherent, and I was going to tie it back to Goldrat's inherent simplicity and harmony. And he talks about, and this is, I think, something that the industry has gone down the wrong hole. I'm totally on board with The Choice as a book I highly, highly recommend. I think The Choice has had at least as much, if not more, impact on me than The Goal. I'm not quite sure why that is, but there are a lot of things that other people talk about in The Goal that it's talked about elsewhere, but The Choice is kind of unique in my mind. And it's the view that there's a lot of perceived complexity, and trying to deal with it is really not a good thing. And that there's a more harmonious way to look at it, that you can see the world by looking at a few of these pieces that actually work in harmony with each other. And what's important then is, how do I decide actions? In other words, I don't need to understand the system as much as I need to understand, if I do this, what's going to happen. And I think there's a lot of cause and effect. People talk about, oh, there's no cause and effect. I'm saying, no, there's a lot of cause and effect. It's embedded in a complex system that we can't fully understand. But if I yell scream at people, I know if I overwork people, I know if I put lousy requirements in, referring to what was just done, I don't gonna have problems with it. So what can we do that lets us take action? And if we don't get the result, then what's happened is there's probably some relationship we hadn't seen, or there's some relationship we don't understand. But now we can move forward.
So I noticed that we are running over time. We have one last question from from Daniel. It's addressed to both of you, but I'll let Jeff take that, and then let's wrap up.
Oh, I thought we had till 12:30.
No, it's till now. No, 12:30 if we include.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
Yeah.
Jeff, go for it.
Well, I'm a big fan of Mike Burrows in general, having worked with him on a number of occasions. And I like what he's doing with Agenda Shift, which is to try to put an overall, kind of almost a meta narrative around a lot of these different practices and put them in space. So in general, I'm a fan. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't be more specific than that, but I love his stuff.
Okay, so I think that must be it, because we're late, and just one very brief round of your last comments on this webinar, on this. No, it's not a panel; it's more like free form. Would you like to come back and repeat this experience?
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, talking to me. I thought you were talking to the audience. If they'd like to hear it. I love chatting with you too. Yeah.
So your last comments?
I think, if I were to just, I'm not sure if I was able to share this across, but I think anything I can do to encourage people to take a patterns-oriented approach to figuring out their system of work, I'm all for it. I think the more we can get people out of having the solution defined for them, but give them a set of practical tools to go and define that solution, the more people are going to actually kind of solve this. How do I be more agile at large scale type of problem? So definitely a conversation worth having.
Al?
Yeah, I would say, let's say three things here quick. One is there's a lot of nonsense out in the world, a lot of myths, and some of them go all the way back to the Agile Manifesto. So one thing I would suggest is don't believe anything, question it, do your own critical thinking on it. And with that, I'll make two recommendations. One is I highly recommend reading A Timeless Way of Building by Chris Alexander, which is where I learned the new kind of design. And I see Tom's here. Tom Gilb is one of the most unheralded people in the world. He's been around forever. I mean, he was doing Agile before there was Agile. I mean, I'm serious. And his work is, and I'm not getting paid by this plug. So Tom and I know each other and we like each other, but we haven't worked together yet, really. But his work is just absolutely brilliant. And I highly recommend getting his latest book on things and any of his writings. And Tom, throw something in the chat if you want. But those would be my three things.
Okay, so we have we have a comment from Tom actually. This is patterns should be judged on their qualities and costs. Of course, patterns should be quantified. What else, Tom? I know that's your topic, and yes. Thanks for everyone. The other people thanking. So I thank everyone. Just the last thing, a reminder again that on Thursday, check out Daniel Doiron, who will be talking about flow mental models. And there is a connection to Richard's last comment about the flow efficiency parts and so on. And having said that, thank you, Al. Thank you, Jeff. It was great having you here. It was an amazing conversation. It's not every day you can talk about patterns in this way. I really enjoyed it, and hope to see you soon back on this channel or some other channel. In fact, Al, we are on something tomorrow, right?
Yeah, I know, this is my week.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, everyone. Bye-bye, and until the next Campfire talk with Herbie. Bye.
Bye.